Before we recreate this page, I want to just show you that you can combine absolute divs and divs that don't have absolute positioning, and what happens when you do. So I've created a special file here called Leaves Paintings 2. That's in the Leaves Paintings folder. And I've done that because I wanted to have a page we could experiment with without affecting the main page in the site. Notice too, if you open the CSS panel, there are two style sheets attached to this file, and both of them have a 2 after them as well. One of the advantages of using external style sheets is that you can use them on multiple pages, but one of the consequences is that if in your effort to refine a particular page, you make changes to the style sheet, you have to remember that those changes can affect other pages in the site. So if you accidentally alter the design of one page while you're fixing another, you can end up with rather unpredictable results. There are a number of solutions to this. One of them, as you see here, is to create styles that are specific to each page. So I have a whole section of styles here that start with the word paintings, and I know those might be different from the section on greeting cards, for example. Another way to distinguish styles is to have multiple style sheets. So you might have one style sheet that applies to most of the elements in the site that you want consistent across different pages, and then individual style sheets that have the styles specific to the page or section you're working on. And that's a nice way to kind of keep them organized and make sure that you don't accidentally make changes to a style that can affect other styles in the site. Of course, intentionally making changes to a style that affects all of the pages in the site can be a very quick way to make updates and changes. Just keep in mind that as you create external style sheets and apply them to multiple pages, you start to impact more than just the page you're working on when you change the styles. And that's why I created copies here. And it's a good trick if you just want to experiment a little bit with a design and you want to make sure that you don't mess up your original style sheets. Just make a copy of those style sheets, detach the ones that were there, attach the copies, and you can experiment knowing that you're not going to affect other pages in the site. So knowing that we're safe working on this page, let's do a little experimentation here. I want to change the positioning of the div that surrounds everything in this side of the design. Remember, if you're not sure what a div is called, because of course you haven't created this page, so how would you know that? You can just place your cursor somewhere in the div, and then if you use the tag selector at the bottom of the page, you can click on any of these tags, and Dreamweaver will select the elements in the design space so you can identify what tag is affecting it. So here I can see Paintings Right is the name of the style of this div. So in my painting style sheet, I want to find the style called Paintings Right. And I'm going to close the Files panel so I can see what's happening here. So this div is aligned to the right, it has some margins and padding, it has a width set. I want to change the positioning. So if I double click on it, I can go to the Positioning category, and let's set Positioning Type to Absolute, and click OK. Now when I do that, immediately a couple of things change, and one of the most dramatic is you see this little crosshair at the top left, and a hand appears when you roll over it. And watch this. I can now move this div by simply clicking and dragging. That's not true of the divs that we've been creating so far in this series. You can't click and drag these divs. The only way you can reposition a div, if you haven't set positioning to absolute, is by changing the style in the CSS Styles panel. But once the positioning of a div is set to absolute, a number of features in Dreamweaver come into play. So if I make sure I've got the actual div selected, notice here at the bottom, I now have many other options in the Property Inspector. And we'll use all of those throughout the rest of this lesson. And as I said, you can click and drag to move this around. So let's just adjust this a little bit and see what happens. I'm going to save this page, and I'm going to preview it in a browser again. Now Dreamweaver is telling me that in order for me to preview this, I have to save more than just the page that I'm on. That's because when you're making changes to a page that affect the CSS file, Dreamweaver doesn't actually save the CSS file until you tell it to. It'll make the changes in the CSS file, but it won't actually save the document. Believe it or not, that's for your benefit. That's Dreamweaver trying to make sure that you can still use the undo feature if you make a change to the CSS and you haven't yet saved the page. So until you save the page, you can still undo changes to CSS, but only if Dreamweaver doesn't actually change the external CSS file. When you go to preview the page, Dreamweaver reminds you that until that file is saved, you won't see those changes reflected in the browser. So you always want to save the CSS file before you preview. So now you can see some very different things happening here. Let me bring this page back over here a little bit. Hey, that's sort of what we intended with our design, right? In fact, that looks a lot like the design we had before. And remember, we've centered that div, so when we move things around, wait a minute, everything doesn't move anymore. This is one of the benefits and consequences of absolute position divs, and what happens when you mix them with elements like the other divs on this page that are centered. Combining divs like this one with absolute positioning with divs that don't use absolute positioning can lead to some very cool effects. Like you can have one div that never moves even when everything else does, and it creates the effect that something sort of floats on the page. But if you aren't very careful or you don't realize what's happening, you can get some very unintended consequences, like a page design like this one, where one element covers up other elements in a way you wouldn't desire. This is another example of why it's important to test every design you create on different size monitors, or at least with different size window settings. Because something that looks perfect on your screen could look completely different on someone else's.